Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I have Dave with me today, and we're going to be talking about getting buy-in for innovative ideas within an organization. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, can you give everybody an introduction?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Emma. Super excited to be on and having this conversation with you. My name is Dave Crysler, and I own an operations consulting business working mostly with leaders in manufacturing and distribution spaces, helping them to optimize business process, create systems throughout the organization. And obviously part of that is change management and dealing with the things that we're going to be talking about today. So excited to be here and to have this conversation with.
Well, thank you for joining me, and also for upstaging me on the backlit situation there. It looks very nice.
I tried to color coordinate as best as I could.
Yeah. So I want to start, the name of the game on this show is always a level setting question. So when you're working with your clients, specifically in training situations, what are some of the questions that you receive that are kind of tied to this idea of getting buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, right, from a leadership standpoint, we're obviously recognizing that there is some sort of need for change. And often the questions center around, how should we be communicating this effectively? How do we make sure that, the kind of big ideas aren't getting lost? How do we make sure that we're also receiving ideas and making sure that there's kind of that two-way communication flow happening? And, whether we're talking about kind of training around continuous improvement, lean manufacturing initiatives, quality initiatives, right? It's typically starting off with some sort of specific idea for improvement and then taking a bit of a more broad approach in terms of bringing the two groups of people together. I kind of utilize the example of oftentimes when you go into a facility, you'll hear things from leadership in the realm around, how do we connect with the people that are doing the work? How do we communicate? How do we make sure that we're actually, moving the needle forward? And then when you go out to the shop floor, right, you hear the opposite. Boy, I wish we could communicate more effectively with the leaders. I wish they would listen to our ideas. I wish that, we could do X, Y, Z in order to be able to really move the needle here. So it's, for me, it's really about bringing those two sides together in kind of this effective communication method, and making sure that we're actually moving the needle forward in the business.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of that effective communication and or other tips that you have for people as they're starting to try and position these ideas.
Yeah. Again, kind of the best tip that I can really give people is that regardless of which side you're kind of on, right? Regardless of if you're on the leadership side and you're trying to connect with and communicate with folks that are doing the heavy lifting, or you're on the other side of the fence trying to go kind of upstream, right? It's all about speaking people's language and communicating with them, kind of meeting them where they're at. And that's what often builds that kind of effective communication. So when I'm talking to people out on the shop floor, a lot of times I'm kind of sharing, the leadership's perspective, because again, without a clear understanding of kind of what leadership is dealing with and kind of their constraints, it's really challenging sometimes for other folks to understand, that position, right? So then how do we speak their language, and vice versa? So one of the things I share with the people out on the shop floor often is the fact that, in most cases, leadership's kind of general kind of resistance to change often centers around this idea of a lack of confidence. And what I say to that is, it's not so much a lack of confidence kind of internally, right? But it's a lack of confidence in understanding what the potential future outcome is versus having a comfort of what's happening today from, kind of a process execution standpoint, understanding what the results are today. So there's a lot more comfort in knowing what's happening today, even if the results aren't ideal, as compared to implementing some sort of a change and really not understanding the results. So I go back to, how do we then communicate effectively? How do we speak in their language if we're trying to go upstream and present ideas to leadership to change, right? So there's some really good concepts in there in terms of how we like to lay that out. I really go with kind of a 4-step process around that thought process, which is, we've got to gather data, we've got to analyze the data, we've got to be able to present our position in an effective manner. And the fourth one, which is often missed by people, we've got to do some sort of follow-up kind of reporting. And that last piece that people often miss around any type of change initiative is really what helps to build that confidence muscle throughout an entire organization.
So I want to dive into those first 2 ideas a little bit further to round out our conversation. So collecting data, analyzing it, but how do we go about doing that in a way that helps us tell us?
Yeah. So, when it comes to gathering the data, there's really kind of 2 key parts to understanding what that is. You've got to know and identify what resources are going to be consumed. So when we can identify and understand what those resources are, then it is way easier to be able to collect that data and ultimately then utilize that within telling the story, within presenting our case. Because again, when it comes to actually presenting our position for change, right, it's much bigger than just what's the problem, what's the change idea, what's the data behind it. We want to talk about, okay, well, now that we've gathered some data, what did we learn with that data, right? How did we analyze it? What were the questions that we asked in and around it? How did we identify the resources that, we gathered data on? So answering all of those questions kind of in a proactive manner really, really helps to kind of round out when you are going and presenting that change initiative and kind of presenting your case, right? All of that then comes together from a standpoint often of a return on investment model, which again, getting back to kind of the initial thought process of speaking people's language, right? When we're trying to go upstream and presenting change to leadership, oftentimes we're talking about a return on investment model. That's really speaking their language. And the rest of it then becomes the support system in place to get you to that return on investment model. Because if we were to just kind of go straight return on investment model without the rest of the building blocks and kind of the support, again, I get back to, it's really easy to, from a confidence standpoint, from a leadership perspective, to say, I think we're just going to keep things kind of the way that.
Thank you so much for joining me for the discussion. And if you're not already, make sure you make your way over to Dave's LinkedIn, give him a follow. And then you can also typically see us in the comments of posts of one another as well. But thank you so much for joining me again, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back weekly for more expert interviews on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technology.